Beneath the polished pages of history lie children whose names were struck out, their faces blurred, their graves empty. What if the bloodlines we were told had ended never truly did, and their descendants still walk among us, carrying secrets the record books refuse to keep? Welcome back to history. What you're about to hear is not a tale passed down for amusement, but one whispered across generations like a wound that never healed. From the first years of the 19th century through the dawn of the modern era, America carried within its records peculiar stories, carefully worded notations, and whispers that spoke of children born unlike any others. They were not merely infants brought into the world under difficult circumstance. They were siblings marked as strange twins who seemed mirror-perfect in a way that unsettled those who saw them, triplets who shared uncanny ailments, brothers and sisters whose blood defied ordinary disease, or whose likeness seemed to stretch beyond the natural into something unexplainable. These children did not pass unnoticed. Their families, fearful of ridicule or scandal, often locked their existence behind parlor doors or erased them from census ledgers with single strokes of ink. Yet fragments survived. Midwives left quiet remarks in diaries, physicians penned letters to colleagues under veiled pseudonyms, and neighbors whispered of voices heard at night, of children glimpsed briefly and then never again. Each small detail forms part of a larger, darker puzzle, that beneath the surface of polite American society ran hidden bloodlines, peculiar inheritances that would ripple across generations. In some places, the strangeness was seen as curse. Superstition ran deep in towns and villages, and siblings born marked or deformed were spoken of as omens. Entire families withdrew under the weight of gossip, their children treated as burdens of shame. In other circles, especially among men of science, these siblings were viewed not as victims of fate, but as specimens living material to be studied, dissected, or sold to institutions that promised both secrecy and coin. Behind laboratory walls and asylum gates, their lives were measured not in years but in notes, experiments, and ledgers. There are records that suggest something more deliberate as well. Wealthy estates paying annual sums to physicians for maintenance of dependents. Ministers receiving unsigned letters warning of children never meant to be raised among men. Even photographs that survive in cracked cases show siblings whose faces blur in unnatural ways, as though the lens itself rejected their likeness. Whether curse, anomaly, or hidden inheritance, their stories became threads of a tapestry most chose not to see. And yet the whispers endured. They echo through parish records, in lawsuits filed and quickly dismissed, in census gaps where names should have been written. They linger in oral traditions passed through Appalachian hollows, in New England towns where portraits of families show too many figures for the names listed beneath. The siblings born strange were not a handful of isolated curiosities. They were part of a pattern, a shadowed current beneath the river of America's progress, one that touched plantations, parishes, factories, and schools. This is not folklore, though superstition clings to it. It is not invention, though silence has blurred its edges. It is history hidden, distorted, and macabre. To trace the lives of these siblings is to step into a record America never wished to preserve, yet could never entirely erase. Their fates remind us that even in an age of liberty and expansion, entire bloodlines were bound not by freedom but by secrecy, and their legacies remain unsettled even now. In the quiet ink of early American census records, a story hides in plain sight. The ledgers, meant to measure households, acreage, and livestock, sometimes betray an unease the enumerators themselves could not explain. In towns across New England between 1,800 and 1,840, margins that should have carried names of sons and daughters are instead left blank, or marked with peculiar shorthand no official key ever explained. Where one column might read 4 children under 10, the next might note an additional figure, peculiar dependent, unfit, or in some cases only a symbol, a triangle, a cross. A circle with a line struck through it, These notations, written by steady hands in neat script, suggest something the census takers did not dare spell out. What did those marks conceal? To some they were dismissed as clerical errors, the idiosyncrasies of overworked men trudging from farmhouse to farmhouse. But to those who compared records year after year, a troubling pattern emerged. Families with ordinary listings, names, ages, occupations, would suddenly include a symbol or a blank, and by the following decade, the entry vanished. No marriage record, no death notice, no gravestone to explain the absence, just silence, as though a child had been swallowed whole by the paper itself. Historians who revisit these ledgers note the discretion in language. Where poverty or illness were involved, census men wrote bluntly, pauper, insane, deaf, mute. But the strange siblings were rarely described directly. Instead, they were obscured behind euphemism. A farmer in Vermont with 3 sons is noted also for one peculiar, though the column for dependents should not have carried such a term. In Connecticut, a minister's household records 2 daughters, a son, and 1 unnatural. The word is underlined twice, as though the man with the pen wished to distance himself from what he wrote. The margins deepen the mystery. Some bear initials no one recognizes, others symbols resembling astrological signs. In one Massachusetts township, 6 families across 2 decades record identical marks beside their children. A small circle punctured by a straight vertical stroke. No official explanation exists. What compelled different enumerators in different towns to record the same unorthodox notation? Some suggest a quiet code passed among officials, a way of acknowledging what polite society refused to speak aloud, that some households harbored children who did not fit the order of nature. For the families, the census offered both concealment and exposure. To erase a child entirely was impossible. To mark them with a symbol was a compromise. It told the government that another mouth lived in the house, but not a name, not a face, not a life in full. For later generations, those gaps became more haunting than a record of death. Death has closure. A symbol in a margin carries only questions. The whispers born from those ledgers fed rumor in the towns themselves. Neighbors asked why shutters remained closed during daylight, why a family's children were seen in the yard one year and never again. Mothers hushed their own little ones when they strayed too close to certain fences. Clerks went home with the knowledge that they had written something no one wanted read. And through the silence of those pages, America's earliest census records carried a warning that behind the tidy statistics of growth and prosperity, something strange was being hidden, not erased, but carefully coded into the nation's own foundation. In the autumn of 1807, in a small Pennsylvania township bordered by rolling farmland and a narrow creek, the Weaver family welcomed twin daughters. At first, they were spoken of with the same joy that met any birth in that close-knit community, but within months, their presence had stirred unease. Neighbors who came to offer congratulations later recalled a disquiet they could not name. The girls, identical in every feature, carried eyes so dark they seemed to swallow candlelight. A midwife wrote in her private journal that the infant's gaze was black and depthless, reflecting no flame, no glint, only a stillness that unsettled the heart. As the years passed, the Weaver twins grew into children of uncommon quiet. They rarely cried, rarely laughed, and when they spoke, it was often in whispers shared only between themselves. Townsfolk described their movements as strangely mirrored, one raising her hand to her hair at the same moment the other did, one pausing mid-step while the other froze, as if controlled by the same invisible rhythm. Parents in the village urged their own children not to linger at the Weaver fence, yet stories spread of playmates who swore the twins knew their thoughts, finishing sentences that had never been spoken aloud. By their 10th year, the twins had become a subject of fascination tinged with fear. A traveling preacher visiting the township refused to enter the Weaver home, declaring from the pulpit that children born with the same shadow may carry the same curse. Yet for all the whispers, no formal complaint was ever made. The weavers were respected landowners, their farm producing ample harvests, their name solid in the county ledger. Still, a shift occurred when the girls suddenly disappeared from public life. Census takers in 1810 noted only 2 children in the household, the twins absent from the count. Neighbors asked cautious questions, but the answers were vague. Some claimed the girls had been sent to live with relatives in Philadelphia, others that illness had carried them off, though no burial records were ever filed. What remained instead were fragments of diary entries and a handful of letters suggesting another fate. One neighbor, a farmer's wife named Ann Lytle, wrote in her journal of wagons arriving at the Weaver property after dusk, driven by a man in a physician's coat. She described hearing cries muffled quickly and seeing lanterns moving in the barn long after midnight. Another letter, attributed to a cousin, speaks of a Dr. Harlan who promised the family treatment for their daughters. His studies concerned with sanguineal properties and blood that does not dim. These documents suggest the twins were not lost to sickness, but handed into private care for reasons the family never spoke aloud. By the middle of the decade, their existence was reduced to rumor. No one in the township saw the twins again, and no records of their lives appear in church or court. Their absence lingered like a shadow across the Weaverland, a silence neighbors carried uneasily, never naming it outright, yet never forgetting it. In the brittle pages of journals and the coded language of letters, the story of the Weaver twins endures only as a question: what became of 2 girls whose eyes reflected no light, and what knowledge did a physician hope to draw from their blood? Among the scattered papers left behind in forgotten archives, a series of letters once sealed with crimson wax have come to light. They bear the hand of Dr. Elias Crandall, a physician trained in Boston at the turn of the 19th century, whose reputation among his peers was both celebrated and quietly questioned. In the polite circles of medical societies, Crandall was praised for his precision, yet beneath that surface ran a current of whispers, rumors that his interest in anatomy stretched beyond accepted bounds. The letters, addressed to a medical society in Boston, survive as fragments, but what they reveal is a glimpse into a world where science crossed lines no community was prepared to admit. Crandall wrote of siblings born to rural families, children he described with phrases that arrest the eye even today: shared veins, an unnatural vitality, and organs sustained in duplicate. His tone was neither fearful nor sympathetic, but cold, measured, the language of a man who viewed these young lives not as sons and daughters, but as phenomena. He catalogued their conditions as though they were entries in a ledger, comparing pulses, recording the symmetry of their features, and noting the peculiar resilience of their bodies. One passage speaks of twins whose blood seemed to flow in rhythm, a wound to one mirrored in discoloration upon the skin of the other. Crandall marveled at what he called cross-circulation, suggesting that the siblings' bodies were less 2 lives than one extended system. In another letter, he hinted at triplets born in New Hampshire, children he claimed were unfit for ordinary upbringing, yet too remarkable to surrender to Providence. He urged his colleagues to support a private fund for their study and preservation. What troubles the modern reader most is not simply the detached observation, but the silence that follows. Crandall speaks of dissections, though always in veiled terms, to separate and examine, to open for the sake of knowledge. Yet for every case he describes, there are no burial records in the towns where the children lived, no gravestones, no parish notes of passing. Families vanish from the census or continue on without the names once listed among their children. The absence is louder than any declaration. In Boston's Society Minutes, Crandall's name appears often, his presentations noted as curious or innovative. Yet never are the specifics of his demonstrations recorded. Only in his private correspondence does the shadow fall fully, hinting at children whose bodies were claimed for study, then erased from the pages of ordinary life. The letters suggest not an isolated curiosity, but a network of physicians willing to look the other way, to accept results without asking how they were obtained. What remains today are brittle sheets of parchment, ink faded but legible, carrying the voice of a man who treated the extraordinary lives of siblings as material for progress. They are evidence not only of Crandall's pursuits, but of a society complicit through silence, where knowledge was pursued even at the expense of the most vulnerable, and where the children themselves were reduced to footnotes that never reached a grave. The Whitfield estate stood among the grandest in Virginia, its white-pillared house rising above acres of fertile tobacco fields. To visiting merchants and parish officials, the family embodied prosperity and refinement. Guests were welcomed with silver on the tables, fine horses in the stables, and children whose manners were praised as the very picture of breeding. Yet behind the polished veneer of hospitality lingered a peculiarity that unsettled even those too polite to mention it aloud. The Whitfields had 3 sons, and year after year those boys remained unchanged. The first whispers began in 1823, when a traveling painter was commissioned to capture the family in oil. His portrait shows a proud father, lines of age already etched into his face, his wife with a softness around her eyes, and 3 boys standing shoulder to shoulder, their features identical to one another, though separated by a year each in birth. The artist's notes, preserved in a surviving journal, mention the difficulty of capturing their expressions. "They did not fidget, nor did they blink," he wrote. "Their eyes fixed upon me with a steadiness unnatural in children." A decade later, another portrait was commissioned, this time for a wedding gift to the eldest son's betrothed. Yet when the painting was unveiled, those who had seen the first gasped quietly. The parents now bore the unmistakable weight of time, hair graying, posture stooped, but the 3 sons appeared exactly as before. Their faces were smooth, their stature unchanged, their eyes fixed with the same dark steadiness. Servants whispered behind closed doors that the brothers had not gained so much as an inch in height since the first portrait. To the casual guest, it was an odd coincidence, perhaps the fault of an artist's hand. To those who lived within the estate's shadow, it was evidence of something deeply unnatural. Diaries kept by neighboring families tell of whispers that the Whitfields had bargained for their children's vitality. One entry speaks of late-night wagons arriving at the estate, laden not with goods but with figures concealed under tarpaulin. Another tells of a servant dismissed abruptly after confiding that the boys were often fed separately from the household, their meals overseen by a physician whose name never appeared in county records. The most chilling detail lies in the church archives. Communion lists show the parents receiving sacrament faithfully each month, yet the sons' names vanish from the register after their 10th birthdays. When asked why the boys no longer attended, the Whitfields replied that their education required private devotion at home. Few pressed further. In a society where wealth commanded silence, most found it easier to look away. But the portraits remained, silent witnesses hung in gilded frames. To every generation that visited the estate, they posed the same question. How could 3 boys remain unchanged while time carved itself into everyone else? The answer, whispered in kitchens and along parish pews, was that their health had been purchased, not granted that somewhere, someone else had paid the cost for the Whitfield sons to stand forever young. The fire at Cold Spring Asylum in 1831 was recorded in county ledgers as a tragedy of misfortune. Official accounts list 30 children dead, their small bodies claimed by smoke and collapsing beams. Newspapers described it in sober language, mourning the loss of innocent lives and praising the bravery of attendants who tried in vain to save them. Yet beneath the solemn reports, the townsfolk whispered a different story, one that suggested the flames were not merely an accident, and that not every child was truly lost. Cold Spring had long carried a reputation as a place apart. Situated on the edge of the valley, its brick walls were streaked with moss, and its windows barred. It called itself an asylum, though most children who entered were simply orphans with no place else to go. Farmers donated food when harvest was good, and the church sent clothes each winter. but those who lived nearby spoke of strange cries carried on the night air, voices rising not in play but in fear. More than one passerby claimed to see children peering through the barred windows whose faces looked too pale, their eyes too fixed. When the fire consumed the building, it was said to have started in the attic, spreading so quickly that no bucket brigade could hope to contain it. Witnesses told of screams mingling with the roar of the flames, of desperate hands pressed against glass before the panes shattered in the heat. Yet even in the chaos, some swore they saw wagons rolling away from the asylum, their drivers silent, their cargo hidden beneath heavy canvas. Local lore holds that 6 siblings, described as odd, even by the standards of the asylum, were taken out before the first flames rose. Surviving staff never confirmed it, though one nurse, years later, confessed on her deathbed that benefactors from outside the county had come to claim the children days before the blaze. She described them as siblings not by birth but by resemblance, each carrying marks upon their bodies that made them subjects of whispered fear. Townsfolk said the children were never meant to be raised among men, a phrase repeated with both dread and awe. No graves for those 6 were ever dug in the churchyard. Their names do not appear in the list of the dead. Some claimed they were carried north to Philadelphia, others that they were delivered into the care of physicians who spoke of advancing knowledge. A darker rumor suggested the fire itself had been set deliberately, to erase records and cover the removal of the children. Whatever the truth, the destruction of Cold Spring ensured that answers would never be clear. To this day, the site of the asylum lies in ruins, its foundation overgrown, its stones blackened. Locals avoid it after dusk, whispering that cries still echo from the ground where so many children perished. Yet the most enduring fear is not of the ghosts of those who died, but of the 6 who lived, taken away into silence, their fate written not in ashes but in secrecy. When photography first arrived in America during the 1840s, it was hailed as a miracle of science. For the first time, families could preserve not just painted likenesses but living detail faces, clothing, the gleam of a child's eyes caught in silver and light. Yet alongside the marvel came unease. In attics and private collections across New England and the South, there survive daguerreotypes that do not behave like other portraits. They depict families seated stiffly in their Sunday best, fathers with stern gazes, mothers composed with folded hands, children posed obediently at their feet. But in certain plates, one or more siblings appear blurred, translucent, or strangely absent, as though the lens itself rejected them. Collectors who discovered these images years later called them curiosities, accidents of exposure, or proof of faulty chemistry. But patterns emerge that are difficult to dismiss. In photograph after photograph, the ordinary children of a household appear sharply rendered, while a brother or sister, always the one whispered about in parish records or listed in census margins with strange notations, looks faded, their outline incomplete. In some, only a faint smudge suggests the place where they sat, a suggestion of shoulders or the faint line of a jaw before dissolving into the backdrop. In others, the siblings appear fully formed but pale as smoke, their faces blurred while the curls of their hair remain sharp. One collector's archive, uncovered in the 1890s, revealed nearly 24 such portraits, all hidden in a locked trunk marked only with the initials of a Boston photographer. Tucked among the plates was a letter never mailed, in which he confessed that certain children do not take. He described repeated attempts with longer exposures, different chemicals, even multiple sittings. But the results remained the same. The child appeared as a shadow or not at all. His words carry the tone of a man unnerved by what he could not control. Families rarely displayed these portraits. Many were sealed away immediately, handed to ministers or tucked into trunks beneath floorboards. Yet the few that surface today tell a consistent story. They are not random failures. They belong to the very households already marked by whispers of odd siblings, children thought peculiar or touched by something unnatural. To see them preserved in fading silver is to glimpse a silent testimony that written records never dared speak plainly. The effect unsettles even modern eyes. A family stands whole yet fractured, a son or daughter present but insubstantial, as though already half removed from the world of the living. These hollow photographs serve as haunting reminders that the strangeness whispered in ledgers and letters left its trace even on light itself. Etched into plates that now carry the ghostly outline of children America never wished to see. Among the midwives of 19th century America, stories circulated that never reached the ears of courts or churches but lived on in whispered recollections. They spoke of births that did not go as expected, when the child that entered the world bore marks or traits that unsettled even the most seasoned attendants. Sometimes it was an infant with eyes clouded black from corner to corner, or with veins traced visibly across the skin in patterns like roots. Sometimes the anomaly was less visible, an eerie stillness, a refusal to cry, or a twin so identical to its sibling that the midwife swore she was seeing the same child twice. In such cases, the testimony reveals, choices were made in silence. Families with means, fearful of gossip and ruin, would summon trusted intermediaries. A quiet knock at the door would bring a physician or a stranger with coin in hand. The bargain was simple. The infant deemed wrong would be removed under cover of night, and another child, healthy, ordinary, borrowed from an orphanage or poorer household, placed in its cradle. To the outside world, nothing had changed. A farmer's wife announced her new son at Sunday service, a merchant's family displayed their twins at market, and no one beyond the walls knew that the child in the crib was not the one born beneath that roof. The original infants, the testimonies suggest, were not destroyed but delivered to hidden places. Some midwives described coaches arriving at midnight, bearing sealed instructions, the babies wrapped in linen and carried away to unknown destinations. A few believed they went to private estates where wealthy patrons funded studies of unnatural heredity. Others whispered of institutions masquerading as schools or hospitals where the children were raised apart from ordinary society. The payments ensured silence. Mothers too frightened to speak were reassured with coin pressed into their palms, while fathers accepted the bargain as protection of the family name. Midwives, bound by necessity to secrecy, recorded the events in coded diaries that surfaced only generations later. One such diary, preserved in brittle pages, contains repeated entries of exchanged at cradle, followed by initials of families that otherwise appear respectable in census rolls and church records. Local lore kept the memory alive. In some towns, villagers muttered that a certain boy looked nothing like his kin, or that a girl's temperament seemed foreign to her bloodline. These suspicions were rarely voiced aloud, for to accuse a family was to risk social exile. Yet the undercurrent of unease remained, reinforced each time another household produced a child who seemed too perfect, too ordinary, as if carefully selected to fit a mold. The cradle exchanges reveal a truth as chilling as any fire or ledger, that some families chose to erase their own children, trading blood for secrecy. And in doing so, they ensured that the siblings born strange did not vanish entirely, but lived on in shadows, hidden from view, their existence acknowledged only in the guarded confessions of those who carried them from one crib into another. High in the ridges of Appalachia, where the mists linger long after morning and voices carry further than they should, stories endure of three sisters whose cries became part of the land itself. The year most often named is 1854, though elders claimed the girls had been heard years earlier, their voices weaving through the hollows at night. They were daughters of a man known simply as William Keene, a farmer who scratched out a living on rocky soil and kept to himself more than most. What set his family apart was not his poverty or isolation, but the sounds that seeped from his cabin after dusk, wails so piercing and mournful that neighbors swore they could feel the air tremble in their lungs when the sisters keened together. Travelers who lodged in the valley carried the tales beyond the mountains. They spoke of cries that rose without warning, echoing from ridge to ridge, and within days, someone in the community would die an accident in the mine, a fever taking hold, or a stillborn child. Families began to speak of the sisters not as girls but as omens, messengers of death disguised in human form. Mothers drew their children indoors when the wailing began, and men muttered prayers under their breath, afraid to admit how the sound unsettled them. County court records, brittle and half-forgotten, confirm that unease turned to open conflict. More than once, neighbors filed petitions against William Keene, demanding that he keep his daughters confined. The documents are vague, written in the stiff legal language of the time, but they cite disturbance of the peace and public nuisance tied explicitly to unnatural vocal exertions of the Keene children. The very phrasing betrays a discomfort the court could not fully name. Several restraining orders were issued, instructing William to prevent his daughters from sounding after dusk. None appear to have been enforced. Oral tradition claims that William fought to protect the sisters, though others whisper he profited from their reputation, accepting food and coin from families desperate to avoid their attention. Whatever the truth, the tension grew unbearable. By late 1854, the Keene cabin was found empty, the hearth cold, livestock wandering untended. No graves were dug, no possessions left behind. The family simply vanished. Afterward, some swore the cries still echoed across the hollows, faint and distant, as if the land itself had learned their voices. Others claimed the sisters had been taken by men who saw in them not a curse but a curiosity to be studied. Whether omen, affliction, or something stranger, the Keening sisters remain part of Appalachian memory, three voices carried on the wind, their fate swallowed by silence. Their story passed down only in fragments of law and folklore. In the hushed archives of courthouses and private collections scattered across the South, estate ledgers reveal entries that do not fit the neat arithmetic of farming and trade. Among the columns of cotton yields, livestock counts, and labor costs are line items written in an altogether different hand. They are labeled with terms that seem out of place: medical tithe, preservation stipend, and, most unsettling of all, maintenance of blood. The amounts vary. Sometimes small sums slipped between purchases of seed and tools, sometimes vast figures rivaling the cost of entire plantations. What they purchased is not recorded in plain language, but the repetition across families and counties suggests something more than coincidence. Historians first dismissed these entries as charitable donations to hospitals or medical colleges, yet the dates and names linked to the payments cast doubt on that explanation. In one Mississippi ledger from 1842, the Randolph estate lists an annual tithe of $500 to Dr. C, without specifying a service. The same year, parish records describe the Randolphs' youngest son as frail yet enduring. He does not appear in any census after his 10th birthday. In Louisiana, the Dupree family's accounts contain decade-long payments to a Boston society, the purpose masked under the heading Care of Dependents. No dependents are named. The pattern becomes clearer when viewed side by side. Dozens of Southern dynasties, bound by wealth and influence, funneled quiet payments to physicians and scholars who traveled between estates under the guise of consulting. Diaries of plantation wives, rarely meant for public view, speak of visiting men of science, who came not to treat the sick, but to study the peculiarities of certain children. A letter preserved in Georgia recounts one such visit, describing a boy who could not be photographed and a girl whose pulse skipped in unnatural rhythm. Both were removed from the household shortly after, the family claiming they had been sent to relations in the North. What unsettles modern researchers is the consistency of the language. Maintenance of blood appears too often, across too many ledgers, to be metaphor. It reads instead like an organized network of patrons funding hidden live siblings whose existence threatened the polished image of dynastic families, but whose strangeness was too valuable to discard outright. The physicians who received the tithes did not leave receipts. Their accounts vanish into private correspondence and anonymous bank drafts. The secrecy suggests complicity at the highest levels. These were not isolated families acting in desperation, but a system in which wealth shielded deviation from public eye. The children vanished from pews, from census lists, from portraits, yet their absence was balanced on paper by money-changing hands. The ledgers, brittle now with age, remain as proof that beneath the grandeur of Southern estates lay transactions that preserved not just property and lineage, but secrets written into the very blood of the families themselves. By the 1860s, America was alive with spectacle. Railroads stitched the country together, and along their tracks rose a new kind of entertainment traveling exhibitions that promised wonder, shock, and the thrill of seeing what polite society refused to speak of. Under canvas tents and on makeshift stages, showmen unveiled siblings who drew crowds as curiosities. Twins joined at the chest, triplets so identical they moved like reflections. Children whose limbs grew to grotesque proportions while their faces remained hauntingly childlike. Posters declared them miracles of nature and living wonders, but the story behind their journeys was rarely told. Most audiences believed these siblings had chosen the stage, or that their families displayed them proudly to earn a living. In truth, many were sold outright, or leased in secret arrangements that turned their strangeness into profit. Estate records, uncovered years later, reveal contracts signed by fathers who exchanged their children for lump sums or annual payments disguised as care stipends. Some agreements bound the children to a proprietor until adulthood, though few survived that long under the relentless strain of exhibition. Diaries from the era offer glimpses of the reality hidden behind the curtain. A young woman who attended a fair in Ohio in 1863 wrote that the twin girls she saw smiling beneath lantern light looked terrified when the crowd pressed near. She returned the next evening and claimed the children had been made to sing, their voices trembling, their smiles forced. In Kentucky, a local minister denounced a traveling show after visiting its camp, where he found children kept in wagons at night, chained by the ankles, for their own safety. His words were dismissed as exaggeration, yet rumors spread of bruises and scars hidden beneath costumes. The most chilling accounts come from ledgers of the showmen themselves. Some noted profits beside the names of siblings. Others recorded the cost of replacement stock, as though the children were commodities no different from livestock. One proprietor bragged in a letter that a set of mirror-image triplets doubled his gate fees in New Orleans, while another boasted of a pair of lads whose bones may be studied once their usefulness is done. Communities often turned a blind eye. To speak against the exhibitions was to deny neighbors a night of marvel, and to confront the families who had given up their children risked stirring shame too deep to mend. So the tents kept rising, the wagons kept rolling, and the siblings kept appearing before gasping crowds living proof of difference turned into currency. Behind the applause and the glitter of lanterns lay a truth more disturbing than any act. These children were not merely curiosities of nature, but victims of a trade that flourished in plain sight. Their existence fed both fascination and revulsion, and their disappearance from ordinary households was excused by the promise that someone, somewhere, was giving them a stage. Yet the faces that appear blurred in old photographs, the names reduced to entries in account books, remind us that the price of wonder was often paid in stolen childhoods and lives bartered away for coin. In 1869, the town of Redgate, Missouri, found itself the subject of hushed conversations that never quite reached the printed page. Court files from that year contain a curious string of petitions referring to children placed under protective custody. The language of the documents is vague, their phrasing stiff, as if carefully crafted to obscure more than they revealed. Each petition notes siblings, pairs, or trios removed from their families on the grounds of unfit circumstance. Yet none of these children appear in the subsequent rosters of regional asylums or orphanages where they were supposedly sent. The names vanish as if struck clean from public record, leaving only a trail of paperwork that gestures toward protection but whispers of something else entirely. Local accounts passed through generations speak of wagons seen leaving Redgate late at night, carrying children muffled under blankets, their faces glimpsed only in fragments by neighbors who pressed their curtains closed. Some residents recalled how the families who lost these children were often poor farmers or recent immigrants, people whose protests carried little weight in court. Once the custody orders were signed, no further word was heard. Mothers insisted their sons and daughters had been promised safety and schooling. Instead, the children dissolved into silence. The unease surrounding the disappearances deepened months later, when a farmhouse on the outskirts of Redgate burned to the ground. The property had been rented by strangers, physicians, according to land deeds who claimed to be conducting agricultural research. When neighbors sifted through the ashes, they found scorched notebooks filled with diagrams of veins, sketches of conjoined limbs, and columns of numbers labeled generations. One surviving page, preserved by a local preacher before the authorities swept in, described hereditary traits of oddity and urged further controlled breeding studies. The charred timbers and the chemical stench clinging to the ruins told a story far removed from farming. Official reports labeled the blaze an accident, likely the result of spilled oil near a lamp, but the timing was too precise, the destruction too complete. Every ledger, every instrument, every trace of the work that had been done there was swallowed by fire. No charges were filed, and the men who rented the property were never seen in Redgate again. Whispers persisted that the siblings taken under custody had been delivered to that farmhouse, not for protection but for examination. Some swore that cries had been heard from its cellar on winter nights, carried faintly through the frozen fields. Others believed the fire had been no accident at all, but a deliberate act to erase evidence once questions grew too loud. What remains are the court files, their faded ink naming children who never reappeared, and the lingering suspicion that Redgate's tragedy was not an accident of fate, but a calculated disappearance. In the silence of those missing records, and the ashes of that farmhouse, Missouri gained a scar it never chose to speak aloud. In 1873, New Orleans was a city of contradiction, lavish in its wealth, haunted by its poverty, a place where music drifted through the streets, while whispers of superstition coiled through the air. It was here that newspapers first reported on a sect calling itself the Fellowship of Seven, a strange congregation that gathered not in churches but in candlelit warehouses along the riverfront. Their focus of worship was not a saint or a prophet, but 7 siblings born to a single mother whose name was never given in print. Accounts differ on whether she lived or died in childbirth, but all agree that the children were raised in secrecy, hidden from public view until the fellowship revealed them as vessels of divine mystery. The siblings were said to be identical in feature, though not in age, and bore a presence that unsettled even hardened skeptics. Witnesses described gatherings where the 7 stood in a row, eyes fixed forward, their voices rising together in uncanny unison. They did not chant scripture but spoke of storms before clouds gathered, of fevers before the first cough was heard, of deaths in households that had not yet drawn mourning. The predictions came true often enough to spread fear through the city. Riverboat men crossed themselves when the cult processed near the docks, and mothers pulled children indoors when the sound of 7 voices carried down the alleyways. Reporters covering the fellowship found themselves torn between ridicule and unease. Some called it performance, a clever fraud meant to draw donations from the gullible. Others insisted that the siblings displayed knowledge no trickster could feign. One article in the Daily Picayune described an evening where the 7 declared a storm would sink vessels at sea within 3 days. On the second night, news arrived of a schooner wrecked in the Gulf, all hands lost. The paper mocked the coincidence, but the story spread faster than the skepticism. Then, as suddenly as they had appeared, the siblings vanished. No farewell gathering, no public dissolution, only silence. The warehouses stood empty, the candles extinguished. The Fellowship of 7 collapsed overnight, leaving parish officials scrambling to explain the absence. Some insisted the cult had fled persecution, others that the children had died and their followers scattered in shame. But rumors told another story. Wealthy households in the Garden District were whispered to have taken them in, adopting the siblings under new names and clothing their strangeness in respectability. Servants claimed to glimpse familiar faces in carriage windows, children who should not have belonged to the families they served. Whether stolen, purchased, or willingly surrendered, the fate of the seven was never recorded. What endures is the memory of voices rising as one, forecasting misfortune with a calm certainty that chilled even the skeptical. The fellowship dissolved, but the legend of the siblings lingers like the heavy New Orleans air, suggesting that their disappearance was less an ending than a transformation, an absorption into power, where their gifts could be hidden behind wealth, sealed away from the eyes of the city they once unsettled. Across scattered towns in the late 19th century, whispers began to surface about schools that never appeared on official registers. They were not the one-room schoolhouses where farmers' children learned their letters, nor the seminaries where sons of merchants studied Latin and law. These were private academies hidden behind manicured gates or tucked deep into wooded estates, funded by families whose wealth shielded them from questions. Their pupils were not chosen for status alone but for strangeness. Only siblings marked as peculiar children spoken of in census margins or hushed rumors were invited, sometimes taken from their homes under the guise of scholarship, sometimes delivered by parents who feared scandal more than absence. Survivors who later spoke of these schools did so cautiously, their testimonies marked with the trembling of memory. One recalled arriving at a stone building where the windows were tall but draped, keeping the light dim even at noon. She said the lessons were not in reading or sums but in recitations of blood, where children were made to memorize lineages not their own, tracing family trees drawn in chalk that spiraled like labyrinths. Teachers instructed them to repeat the names of ancestors they had never met, voices rising in unison until the words blurred into sound. Another survivor described morning drills in a gravel courtyard, not calisthenics, but synchronized movements meant to mirror one another. Twins were placed together, triplets arranged in precise order, each step watched by men who recorded results in ledgers. It was not learning, he wrote, but measuring. Punishments were exacting for those who failed to match the rhythm. Some were confined to dark rooms where, through cracks in the boards, they heard chanting that never ceased. The strangest accounts come from descriptions of rituals disguised as lessons. At least 3 testimonies speak of exercises in which a drop of blood was taken from each child, mixed in bowls, and traced across pages as ink. The teachers called it mapping the current. One boy remembered the sting of the needle followed by the command to hold his sibling's hand while the blood dried. Arithmetic was taught, but only through ratios of bloodlines, fractions expressed not in numbers but in terms of kin. These schools left almost no records of their existence. Property deeds were written in the names of shell trusts, and teachers were often itinerant physicians or scholars who vanished as quickly as they appeared. Yet the pattern across testimonies is too consistent to ignore. For decades, elites appear to have funded sanctuaries not of learning but of control, shaping the lives of children already marked as unusual. What remained of those schools after the turn of the century is unclear. Some were abandoned, their buildings reclaimed by ivy and silence. Others were absorbed into institutions that claimed respectability. But the memories of those who endured them speak with one voice. They were never taught to live in the world, only to embody something their benefactors believed was hidden in their blood. In the summer of 1878, Memphis was gripped by an enemy it could not see. Yellow fever swept through the city with a ferocity that left the streets deserted, church bells tolling in grim succession as entire households fell silent in a matter of days. Families boarded windows, wagons carried the dead at dawn, and doctors collapsed from exhaustion as the sick overwhelmed every ward. Amid the devastation, a peculiar detail caught the attention of physicians who recorded their findings in hurried journals. In certain households, where parents and servants perished within hours of one another, small clusters of siblings survived untouched. They were not merely lucky, their blood seemed to resist contagion altogether. Reports of this strange immunity appeared first in private correspondence. A doctor at Howard Row Hospital noted 3 sisters, all under the age of 12, who cared for their dying parents without showing a single symptom. He wrote that their pulses were steady, their skin cool, and that the fever would not take them. Though they shared the bed of the afflicted, another physician recorded a family of 5 brothers who buried their own kin with their bare hands, yet remained well long after exposure should have doomed them. The language of the notes betrays astonishment. Phrases like resists contagion and unnatural endurance appear again and again, as if the men of science could not reconcile what they observed. Word of the siblings spread quickly. Neighbors whispered that they were chosen, marked by providence, or else cursed with blood too strange for disease. Some claimed they could pass through infected wards without fear, angels of mercy or grim reminders of survival. Their presence unsettled even those grateful for their aid, for the very fact that they endured seemed to set them apart from the city's shared suffering. Yet, as the fever waned and the city began to reckon with its losses, another mystery unfolded. Many of these immune siblings vanished from public record. Parish rolls that had noted them during the epidemic showed no trace afterward. Census lists omit their names. Some families insisted their surviving children had been sent north to recover, but no letters confirmed it. In one case, the property of an orphaned household was quietly sold to a trust connected to a physicians' society, the siblings never mentioned again. Local lore suggests they were absorbed into the care of wealthy benefactors or spirited away to institutions where their blood could be studied. A nurse later whispered that vials of their blood were taken in secret, shipped east under labels that read specimens. To this day, no graves bear their names, no marriages or deaths were recorded. They slipped from Memphis as silently as they had endured the fever, leaving behind only the suspicion that survival itself had marked them for a fate hidden from the world. By the closing decades of the 19th century, newspapers had discovered a profitable trade in sensational images. Among the most popular were photographs purported to show ghostly children, strange siblings who appeared half-formed on glass plates, their bodies fading into shadow while their families stood crisp and clear beside them. At the time, editors labeled them hoaxes, clever tricks played by ambitious photographers eager to sell prints to the curious. Columns ran with mocking headlines, declaring the public too gullible to resist illusions of spirit children. Yet for every article that laughed away the phenomenon, another reader clipped the image and tucked it into a Bible or diary, unwilling to forget the unsettling faces that seemed both present and not. The photographs came most often from rural communities, small towns where whispers of peculiar siblings already circulated. One widely circulated plate from Iowa showed a farm family in their Sunday clothes, parents stiff and unsmiling, 3 children at their knees. At the far edge of the frame, a fourth figure is visible, its outline pale and blurred, with a face that seems to slip away the longer one stares. Critics called it a double exposure. But decades later, when the original negative was examined, no evidence of layering could be found. The anomaly was not printed into the image, it was etched there from the moment the lens opened. Other examples followed the same pattern. In Ohio, a set of twins appeared in photographs as mirror images, yet one face was always sharper than the other, as though the plate could hold only one fully. In Georgia, a portrait of 5 siblings showed 4 rendered with ordinary clarity, while the 5th looked translucent, his outline bleeding into the chair he sat upon. At the time, experts dismissed it as chemical failure or careless technique. Modern reviews tell a different story. Negatives preserved in brittle sleeves reveal no tampering, no signs of spilled silver nitrate or mishandled plates. The ghostliness lies not in the process, but in the subject. What unsettled later scholars most was the consistency. These were not isolated tricks of light, but repeated patterns connected to families already whispered about in censuses and diaries. The same households that midwives remembered for odd births and court clerks, marked with symbols, also produced images that defied the technology of their age. When questioned, photographers insisted they had no interest in fakery, some even abandoning the profession altogether after accusations ruined their reputations. One wrote bitterly in a letter, "The fault was not mine. The lens showed what was there, though men refused to see it." By the 20th century, most of these photographs had been locked away or lost, dismissed as curiosities of a superstitious era, but the few that remain are still difficult to explain. Experts admit that the negatives bear no evidence of fraud, and the figures captured on them cannot be accounted for by conventional exposure. The conclusion, if one dares to draw it, is not that the photographs lied, but that the children themselves were never ordinary, leaving behind a trace of strangeness that silver and light could not conceal. The Gilded Age, remembered for glittering wealth and ruthless ambition, carried beneath its surface a current of secrecy as potent as any fortune built on steel or oil. In the shadows of sprawling mansions and smoke-choked factories, certain magnates did more than accumulate railroads and monopolies. They acquired children. Not in the ordinary sense of adoption, celebrated by newspapers with sentimental columns, but through quiet transfers, sealed agreements, and trusts that spoke in coded terms of wards preserved for study and continuation of anomalous lines. These siblings, often born into poverty or abandoned after whispers of strangeness clung too tightly to their families, became the hidden property of industrialists who saw in them something more valuable than coal or iron. A key to bending nature itself. Ledgers preserved in brittle archives tell the tale more plainly than memoirs ever dared. A Vanderbilt cousin funneled annual sums labeled as maintenance of wards to a discreet medical guild in Boston. A Steel baron's estate papers list not only stock dividends, but stipends to physicians described as custodians of the preserved. The language is cold, clinical, but unmistakable. These children were not heirs of philanthropy, they were specimens of curiosity, their lives measured in terms of potential yield. Publicly, the tycoons presented themselves as benefactors, endowing orphanages and schools, building hospitals with their names etched in stone. Behind closed doors, they entertained doctors and scholars who whispered of blood that resisted contagion, of siblings who aged slower than their peers, of uncanny recoveries from injury. In one instance, correspondence between a shipping magnate and his private physician noted the resilience of the twin wards after surviving a fever that claimed dozens in the household. The implication was not merely survival but immunity, a trait seen as a resource to be harnessed, refined, and perhaps replicated. Servants spoke in hushed tones of children who wandered the marble halls but never appeared at public functions, their presence erased from family portraits and guest ledgers. In one New York mansion, a governess described hearing lessons conducted not in arithmetic, but in genealogy, where children were instructed to memorize their ancestry as though it were scripture. Some of these wards were said to vanish into educational retreats, secluded schools funded by trusts that outlived the tycoons themselves. Whether they lived out their days in hidden estates or became subjects of clandestine experiments is unknown. But what remains certain is that their existence was deliberately erased from the narratives of generosity their guardians displayed to the world. The irony of the age was stark. The same men lionized for building America's modern wealth were also curators of a secret collection, strange siblings hidden away, their blood guarded like treasure. To the public, philanthropy gilded their names in gold. Privately, they sought what all fortunes eventually crave. Not money, but time, and perhaps a way to defy the limits of their own mortality. Across the quiet churchyards and sprawling cemeteries of 19th century America, the ground was never as settled as the headstones suggested. Parish records and cemetery ledgers list the burials of children siblings most often noted as unusual in life, yet time and again those who returned years later found the earth disturbed, the markers shifted, and the coffins curiously light when raised for reburial. It became a whispered certainty among sextons and grave diggers that some families or forces tied to them refused to let their strange bloodlines rest in the soil. What should have been solemn places of mourning became sites of unease, where absence spoke louder than grief. In rural Kentucky, a church ledger from 1859 records the interment of three brothers lost to fever. When their plots were opened decades later to expand the cemetery, the coffins contained nothing but river stones arranged with deliberate care, as though placed to mimic weight. In New Hampshire, parishioners remembered the funeral of twin girls, only for their graves to be exhumed during a cholera outbreak. Instead of small bodies, the sexton discovered waxen effigies, faces crudely molded, their features blurred like half-remembered masks. The discovery was hushed, the coffins quietly resealed, and the headstones left standing. Even in the crowded cemeteries of cities like Philadelphia and New Orleans, patterns emerged. Ledgers listed siblings by name and age, yet when disinterments were ordered to make way for new plots, the coffins were empty or held only scraps of paper. Some contained ledgers of their own lists of dates, initials, and cryptic notes about condition, blood, or transfer. These were not errors of bookkeeping, but intentional acts. Whoever reclaimed the bodies left behind tokens to mark the theft, as if daring future generations to piece together the puzzle. Whispers spread that networks of physicians and benefactors had not finished their work when death claimed these children. The siblings, seen as repositories of anomaly, were retrieved under cover of night, spirited away to laboratories or estates where even the grave could not sever their value. Families sometimes colluded, comforted by the belief that their children's strangeness carried a purpose beyond the earth. Others protested, but silence was imposed by debts, intimidation, or the cold weight of social power. The unease left scars on communities. Mothers who visited graves wondered if they prayed over their children at all, or merely at decoys placed to preserve appearances. Ministers muttered sermons about the sanctity of rest, yet even they admitted in private that too many graves had turned up empty. By the dawn of the 20th century, rumors of reclaimed bodies had become part of the macabre folklore of entire counties. The stones, wax figures, and ledgers buried in coffins were not mistakes of record. They were evidence that even in death, strange siblings remained subjects of study, their blood and bone too valuable to leave to the earth. At the turn of the 20th century, the strangeness that once hovered at the edges of parish ledgers and town whispers seemed to dissolve into silence. Where earlier decades had left trails of odd census notations, blurred photographs, and cemetery scandals, the new century brought something colder: absence. With the rise of state oversight, standardized birth certificates, and modern medical boards, the siblings once whispered about were no longer recorded as anomalies. Instead, their traces vanish into the neat bureaucratic lines of medical privacy and family relocation. Officially, the strange siblings ceased to exist. Unofficially, they seemed to scatter like seeds carried by the wind. The families that had carried reputations of peculiarity for generations began to move westward, drawn by the promise of anonymity in booming cities and frontier states. In Street, Louis, a physician's private notes mention a household of 4 children whose names were changed upon arrival, their original identities erased before they entered school registers. In Oklahoma Territory, court documents reference the sudden disappearance of entire family groups, their properties sold overnight, their new locations left blank. The language of relocation concealed what earlier generations might have called exile or assimilation. Government redactions became another veil. Medical files from state hospitals and public health boards between 1905 and 1918 contain entire sections blacked out, citing privacy concerns. In one case, the record of a boy with abnormal resistance to fever ends abruptly with a note: "Custody transferred confidential," where earlier eras left haunting fragments. The new system built walls of secrecy that only deepened suspicion. It was as though the machinery of the state had joined with private families and benefactors to erase anomalies from public sight. Yet whispers persisted. Rumors circulated in universities of certain bloodlines that carried uncanny resilience, of patients who healed with unusual speed, of twins who aged at different rates despite living side by side. Social clubs and marriage registries in Boston, Chicago, and San Francisco hint at unions arranged less for wealth than for lineage, as if strange siblings had not been extinguished but woven quietly into the fabric of influential families. A banker's genealogy in Denver curiously omits the first decade of his life. A politician's obituary in Kansas recalls siblings who died young, though no graves exist. The war years intensified the silence. Military medical records from 1,917 list recruits who seemed to resist influenza or recover from wounds with remarkable speed, but those files vanish into classified vaults. By the 1920s, the trail grows faint, leaving only folklore and uneasy speculation. Were the siblings absorbed into the bloodstream of the nation, their anomalies diluted but never gone? Or did hidden networks succeed in burying them beneath new names, shielding their legacies from ever being traced? The final dispersals left no bodies, no photographs, no open ledgers, only the haunting possibility that their bloodlines did not end but endure quietly among us. History rarely ends with neat conclusions. It frays, it fades, and sometimes it disappears into deliberate silence. The tale of America's strange siblings, children born different, families marked by whispers, and bloodlines carried like hidden burdens does not close with certainty, but with questions that refuse to rest. Did they truly vanish, erased by relocation, redaction, and the careful hands of physicians who wrote privacy into permanence? Or did they simply adapt, their lives folded into new names, new houses, and new dynasties that learned the value of keeping secrets locked behind iron gates? The records themselves speak in absence. Ledgers that once dared to mark peculiar dependents give way to neat rows of ordinary sons and daughters. Cemeteries, once unsteady with exhumed coffins filled with stones or wax, now show no disturbance at all, their lawns trimmed, their plots maintained. Photographs, once blurred with ghostly silhouettes, settle into the crisp clarity of modern portraits where every face appears whole. Yet beneath the surface, unease lingers. Because absence is not proof of disappearance, it is proof of concealment. The very tidiness of the 20th century feels suspicious, as if too much effort was spent smoothing out the scars of the 19th. The final whispers suggest assimilation into wealth and influence, marriage ledgers quietly adjusted, children raised with private tutors in secluded estates. Generations that learned not to display their strangeness, but to refine it, to wear normality like a costume while preserving in silence whatever peculiarities the bloodline carried. By the time their names appeared in newspapers as businessmen, politicians, or philanthropists, the oddities had been buried so deeply that no public eye could see them. But does buried mean gone or merely hidden? It is tempting to think of these stories as folklore, the inventions of frightened villagers or the embellishments of journalists chasing circulation. Yet, the consistency across states, decades, and archives resists dismissal. Too many blanks in census ledgers, too many graves that failed to yield bodies, too many photographs that cannot be explained by the chemistry of silver and light. History carries its scars, and some scars are carefully bandaged, not to heal, but to remain unseen. As the narration closes, the warning is not about the past alone, but about the present. If bloodlines were preserved, if families chose silence over extinction, then descendants may yet walk among us, unremarkable in appearance, but carrying veins marked by a history they will never confess. Whether their strangeness lies dormant or quietly shapes the world around them, no record will tell us. What remains is the uneasy knowledge that some truths were not buried in graves but hidden in plain sight, shielded by wealth, silence, and the passage of time.